Hey, this is Daniel.
I'm Noelle, and this is the Quick Philosophy Question Podcast,
or QPQ for short.
A podcast dedicated to bettering our understanding of philosophy. Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about human nature, and we're going to be asking a question of whether or not people are naturally born good or evil.
Yeah, even though
it's impossible to define good and evil, but we'll get into that too, like the basic values that we assign to good and evil, and we might not completely get into this, but like how this applies to politics and society.
Yeah,
maybe
I was thinking about how it was going, like we might be able to get into how this applies to morality and different views of morality with nature of good and evil.
Yeah, and so we're going to start off by just introducing two leading thinkers in this debate who are Thomas Hobbes as well as Rousseau, and they're going to kind of introduce to us like the polar opposite sides of this argument, and from there we're going to introduce our own viewpoints on this discussion, as well as like any other interesting points we'd like to bring up. So yeah, I'm in charge of Hobbes, who argues that people are naturally evil, and Daniel's in charge of Rousseau, who argues the opposite, which is that people are naturally good. So do you want to start?
Well, yeah, but a quick thing that I want to mention, these, during this part of this podcast, we are going to be trying to summarize their thoughts on this problem, but then we will develop our own thoughts later on.
Yeah, like right now we're just like summarizing like the basic arguments from their perspectives.
Yeah. Cool. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it might be useful if you go first.
Okay. All right. Thomas Hobbes. Okay. Now, I just want to start off by clarifying the reason today's question was why humans are born evil rather than naturally evil was merely to start off simple and avoid all the complications that come with the state of nature. Because what Hobbes was really arguing was the second definition, that people are naturally evil, which I will get into now. But first of all, who is Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes is a 16th to 17th century English philosopher who dealt primarily with the philosophy of politics and is well known, quite deservedly so, for his unique view on the topic. He published a book called The Leviathan, named after a sea monster, that detailed his political views, and in which he rather aggressively claimed that one should be completely obedient to a sovereign power. Otherwise, humans would just enter a chaotic state of nature due to their fundamental selfishness or self-interest, which we'll get into later. But to quote an article from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, Hobbes thinks the state of nature is something we ought to avoid at any cost except our own self-preservation, this being our right of nature as we saw above. But what sort of ought is this? There are two basic ways of interpreting Hobbes here. It might be a counsel of prudence. Avoid the state of nature if you're concerned to avoid violent death. In this case, Hobbes' advice only applies to us. Number one, if we agreed that violent death is what we should fear most and should therefore avoid. And number two, if we agree with Hobbes that only an unaccountable sovereign stands between human beings and the state of nature. This thought fits well with an egoistic reading of Hobbes, but it faces serious problems, as will be seen. The other way of interpreting Hobbes is not without problems either. This takes Hobbes to be saying that we ought, morally speaking, to avoid the state of nature. We have a duty to do what we can to avoid the situation rising, and a duty to end it, if at all possible. Hobbes often makes his view clear, and that we have such moral obligations. But then two difficult questions arise. Why these obligations, and why are they obligatory? End quote. So that was a really long quote. But essentially what was said that there are two reasons for avoiding the state of nature, but that only the first one claimed that people are naturally bad. But this essentially is how Hobbes argues, is that though people are naturally evil, society necessitates a shift in this behavior. And we'll later come to find out that Rousseau argues pretty much the exact opposite. So do you want to get into that?
Sure. So, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, hopefully I didn't mess that up, was someone who believed that the state of nature was one where everyone was innocent and everyone had compassion and everyone was more...
hang on, sorry. I don't think we've clarified what this... I think the state of nature is kind of like what happens if we just let humans do whatever they want.
Yeah, and there was no...
It's like the natural state of human.
Yeah, and there was no, like, society to mess it up. That's
Right.
Like, that's exactly what Rousseau brings up later on, talking about how he thinks that where all of this started to fall downhill was when agricultural and industrial society started to arise and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So, what Rousseau tries to argue is that in a society, that is... A society is what corrupts the state of human nature, and that's what turns people into petty, like sort of evil actors in a sense. And that society is the thing that makes people more corrupt. He does argue after that, though, is that he creates a new kind of social contract that is based upon the general will of the public that tries to depend way more on the state and is arguing for the collectiveness of people. The reason why that's related to the nature of good and evil is because he's talking about how society at the moment is what is causing everyone to turn into like evil actors or whatever. But if you focus on society as a whole, then you're removing the individualism of a person and making them more into a society, which can have one interest that person has to work towards to benefit that society, instead of thinking of everyone as an individual.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Is that it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, Rousseau thinks that the state of nature is good versus Hobbes, who thinks that it's chaotic and bad.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Alrighty. So I think now we want to kind of get into our own personal views on this issue, and then kind of have a little debate from there.
Sure. Why not?
Yeah. Do you want to start with yours? Because mine is kind of essentially pretty much the same as Hobbes, so I think yours would be a little more interesting.
Yeah. This is my thinking on the problem, that one important thing that is the fundamental basis to both Rousseau and Hobbes'
I think that's how I actually don't know either, but I think that's probably how you pronounce it.
Yeah, hopefully. Rousseau's and Hobbes' argument is that there is a nature to a human being, and that is something that I don't necessarily believe in. That
Dana's gonna questions it all.
Yeah, I'm questioning it all here. Where it's talking about the nature of a human, right? Mm-hmm. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about what determines something. What is the difference between an internal and an external factor of what makes someone a natural human being? Because what's usually comes up here is about nature versus nurture, in the sense that with Rousseau and Hobbes, they are trying to determine what is how the society nurtures someone into a specific evil or better person, as Hobbes believes that it makes someone better when they're in a society, whilst Rousseau believes that it makes someone worse when they're in a society. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that I don't necessarily believe that there's a dichotomy between what is nature and what is nurture, because trying to differentiate yeah, I know, I should probably remember to do that before. Okay, trying to differentiate the difference between nature, like what is naturally born, and how we are naturally raised is not necessarily relevant. Like, it's not necessarily important.
Really?
Yeah, because I
think it's kind of fundamental, especially if we're arguing whether or not you're born good or evil.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm trying to say. I believe, this is my personal belief anyways, that there is some form of determinism with...
Okay, first define determinism.
Determinism, which is basically previous causes lead to future causes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
like, I think this is sort of going off topic, but to simplify my view in this sense of, are we naturally born good and evil? My view in a general sense is that when you're trying to define good, good means something is not an innate concept that can be defined out of an individual. Meaning that calling someone sorry, I mean, like, this is
totally go ahead. But I just disagree.
that calling someone good is not necessarily necessarily something that you can do. Like, from your own standpoint or view of good, then sure, but from theirs, it's not necessarily the same. I don't know how to explain that, but yeah.
Right, but we've kind of come to a consensus as a society about, because we live in a society, but like the whole point is that as a society we've come to a consensus on the values that we believe to be good, and from there, only because everyone else is relevant to the society, you base what is good and bad off of that.
So what it seems like you're talking about is social contract theory, where the morals are defined by the agreement of a society. Okay.
More or less. I mean, I don't think it has to be as like concrete as I think social contract theory is. But I do think that, you know, because we're thinking human beings, like, we're going to come up with like, I feel like that's probably one of the first steps in creating civilization, is like coming up with a set of values to base everything else off of.
Exactly. And that's sort of where I'm making my argument from. Before the agreement happens, the person themselves don't have morals by themselves.
I think they do.
But I mean, like, what are those morals based upon then? If you're talking about,
for example, trying to avoid immediate death. Lots of value, like, you know, someone who saves someone else from drowning is a good person because they've saved that person from dying.
But why?
But assuming that everyone's trying to avoid death, which is not always true. But I think, you know, like, there are scientific fundamentals to our psychology and things that we, like, fundamentally try to avoid. For example, death. Death. And, like, from there's a certain predictability to, from there, what values would be considered good.
So what it seems like you're talking about is intrinsic versus extrinsic values. So, like,
intrinsic versus what now? Extrinsic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Extrinsic values, which is like, an intrinsic value is something that is inherently valuable to that person, or like inherently valuable to that thing, whilst an extrinsic value is something that leads to an intrinsic value.
Yeah.
For example, with hedonism, it's pleasure, right? Whilst with other things,
define hedonism.
Hedonism is the search for pleasure, and also, like, it's like a philosophy where you're trying to only
so you
get
just gotta
pleasure.
define everything.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So, and that's a version of intrinsic versus extrinsic value. Another version of that is with utilitarianism, which is trying to maximize pleasure or happiness and trying to have the absence of pain, right? And that is another intrinsic value to that philosophy, right?
Yeah.
That has extrinsic values that, like, are certain, like, things that are good, like compassion and kindness and, like, trying to save other people and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
So what is interesting to me is that when you have all these different things that people can value more than other things, individual values can be different than others, like with the way that they prioritize them, not necessarily with the individual values that we have. Then that can lead to different goods and different evils in certain senses if those values conflict.
Yes.
And that's what I believe, that it's hard to say that it's in human nature to define one thing as good or evil, even if you have societal values, because the way that different people prioritize stuff can lead to different things that are morally good or morally evil in certain situations.
Yeah, but it's not gonna be. It's rarely ever gonna be contradictory.
I mean, like, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Like, for example, with pleasure and, let's say, equal freedom or whatever, pleasure and freedom. In the case where if someone values their pleasure more than freedom as a concept, right, then someone could try and maximize their own pleasure by subverting other people's freedom. But if people believe in freedom more than they believe in pleasure, then they try and maximize their own freedom and more than they do their pleasure. I mean,
I think that's different from maximizing values, because pleasure isn't a value. Well, it's like, it's not like a virtue, I guess.
Isn't it though? I mean, like, what would you define as, like, what would you define pleasure as then?
Well, it's not like, it doesn't go on the list with like compassion and like kindness and patience and all the other virtues. It's an objective rather than I don't know what.
Yeah. And that's the thing. That's why it's viewed most of the time as an intrinsic value, whilst the things that you mentioned as compassion, kindness, forgiveness are all considered as things as extrinsic values, which lead to an intrinsic good.
I think
like
it's
value.
more of what drives the values rather than the values themselves.
Can you?
I think I'm using the word value incorrectly. I think it's what drives the creation of values.
Can you go deeper into that?
I think because you create the rest of your values based on a search for pleasure. Sometimes, not all the time. But there's also, wait, hang on. I'll finish that thought. But you were saying, I'm just thinking about this now. You're saying if you value your pleasure over your freedom. Okay. Pleasure over your freedom, or is like someone else's freedom?
Like freedom as, like, when you're thinking about equality, you don't, I'm switching turns here a lot, but
yeah, same. Yeah, I'm using things interchangeably that shouldn't be used interchangeably. But I think this kind of, we're going into kind of like self-interest.
Oh yeah, we wanted to talk about that, right?
Yeah, well, because I think people are very self-interested, and that's a lot of why I agree with Hobbes in that if you allowed people to do like whatever they wanted to, you know, it would become chaos because people are just too self-interested, and obviously not everyone's interested in the same thing, and self-interest leads you to act against others' interests.
And something that I brought up before the podcast started was that I believe that self-interest isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, being self-interested isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
So, talking about Hobbes, this is something that he talks about in his moral theory of contractarianism, right? Which is basically saying that each individual is mutually self-interested, right? And because of that, if they were rational, they would lead to have
act in others' interest in order to get their own interest, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. Like have agreements. Do you want to
like create an example for that, just so it makes more sense?
Yeah, sure. So, this is a neat example that I remember from a YouTube channel called Primer or whatever. Yeah. So basically, there was these two people that had a house, and one grew a mango farm, and one had an apple farm, I think. Okay. So both of them wanted to have apples and mangoes in their diet. So if they did not have a contract or an agreement in any form, the apple farmer would try and steal the mangoes, right? And the mango farmer would try and steal the apples, right?
Yeah.
Leaving them to not be able to tend for their own farms, leading them to both lead into collapse.
Right.
But if they had a mutual agreement where, per se, I'll trade you some form of apples for some form of mangoes, then they would still be able to do the things on their own farm whilst ensuring that they're still going for their own interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a great example. And yeah, I think that's why people have been forced to be social, like social creatures, and why some animals, like hunt in packs versus others are solitary.
Exactly. So, yeah.
So do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I'm trying to disagree with the point that just because the fact that we are self-interested does not necessarily mean that we are bad, but it means that if we were rational, or if we were completely rational, it leads directly to morality.
But so you're accepting the second part of what Hobbes has said into the very definition of self-interest. Like, his second part is that, like, society forces you, right? Like, you have to act rationally in order to achieve your self-interests. And in this particular society, you have to act
like what I view as a really important part of a human being, or of a human, is having self-interest or having an interest. And the point of morality is to achieve your self-interest, which is what Hobbes is saying. So what Hobbes is saying...
Whoa there. The point of morality is to achieve your own self-interest.
Yes.
Expand on that for just a second.
So this is like going to social contract theory again, but Hobbes and other people, well, mostly Rousseau, with contractualism, both describe a theory where, mostly Hobbes is saying that there's contractarianism, where one person is mutually interested, and if they are rational, right, then that leads them to work in their own...
Right. Work with others for their own benefit.
Exactly. So that is what I mean by that.
Okay. All right. Yes. It was just like the use of the word morality that just kind of shocked me there. But,
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Continue. Did you have anything else?
Not really. Not on that end anyways.
Okay. So you're saying that self-interest can be good because sometimes it includes benefiting others, the benefit of others.
Not necessarily. I'm saying that we want self-interest, then morality is based upon that. I'm not...
Like, self-interest is necessary. It's necessary to morality.
It's a part of us as human beings.
It's fundamental.
Fundamental, yes.
Okay.
Fundamental to us as rational, conscious beings. And what morality is trying to do is trying to satisfy that. So I'm not invoking good or evil in this case. But
you're directly agreeing with Hobbes then.
Not necessarily. Because like what Hobbes is saying, like I'm agreeing with part of what Hobbes says, right? Where it's saying that there's a rational when you have a rational agreement of a society to better that. But what Hobbes also says at the beginning is that the state of nature in itself is inherently bad. And what makes that inherent? Like, it's something in the quote that you brought up where it's saying, why is there obligations to change the state of nature? Or why isn't there obligations to change the state of nature? Right? And what I'm trying to explain with that is that with the state of nature, it just means that it's not useful to help us achieve our interests, but it's not necessarily bad. And that's something that I have a problem with the way that both Rousseau and Hobbes are thinking, in the sense that they're both using terms of good and evil in the sense that they're inherently one way or another. And that's why I'm choosing to disagree on that part.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think if you're saying that self-interest is necessary because morality is built on self-interest,
I'm saying that
Is that not what you're saying?
self-interest,
What is you saying?
like, again, something that, yeah, it's self-interest is fundamental, which
To morality.
to us,
To us.
and morality is trying to help us achieve our self-interest.
So it's fundamental to morality.
Like, yeah, sure.
It's fundamental to the existence of morality.
Yes.
Then you're agreeing with Hobbes. But would you say that without self-interest, necessarily you would, wow, I don't know how to speak. Without self-interest, there would not be the existence of morality.
What do you mean? Like,
If you say that self-interest is fundamental to the existence of morality, would you say that it is without it there would be no morality?
Yes.
So you're agreeing with Hobbes.
Sure.
Because he says that self-interest, while it is, at its base, not exactly a good thing, it's transformed into something that is good and fundamental through society.
Why is he? Well, I mean, like, the part that I mainly disagreeing with that, like, most of what you said is I agree with. Mm-hmm. But the part that I'm disagreeing with is the part where he's saying that self-interest inherently is bad.
Because the only reason it's good that you're saying is it necessitates there being a society.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, like, if let's say that there was an individual person mm-hmm. by themselves without a society, mm-hmm. self-interest in that case still can be good. Like, you need self-interest to have a conscious being at that point.
Yeah.
And if you have that conscious being by themselves without a society, that self-interest isn't bad.
It's not, well, self-interest, I think here self-interest is bad because if you put a bunch of humans together that are all acting directly and immediately in their self-interest without the formation of a society, it's going to become chaos.
So what he's also trying to say is that self-interest plus rationality is good because it forms into a better society.
Rationality comes with the creation of a society.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put that. I feel like rationality is part of how a being thinks, not necessarily...
You're saying, like, every person comes with their own rationality.
I mean, like, every person comes with a way of thinking, which is their way of rationalizing about stuff.
What if they contradict each other?
I mean, like, when they're contradicting each other, it's because they have different values, or it's that they're not rationally thinking it all the way through. I mean, like, there's two ways to contradict in that sense.
I mean, yeah, but well, you can't guarantee that every time a person's going to make the best rational decision.
That's what I'm trying, like, all I'm trying to say is that
it's going to end up as chaos.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to say, like, in the sense that chaos is... Okay. In the sense that Hobbes, I would agree with Hobbes if he's saying that in self-interest and in self-interest and also in rationale, right? If both of those things are, like, there, mm-hmm. then that can lead to a society where it benefits that individual person. Sure. Mm. But if self-interest without the rationale, meaning, like, complete rationale, right? Or even, we don't even have complete rationale now, but, like, not strong enough rationale for the people that are in that society, then it can lead to chaos. But that isn't necessarily a part of self-interest by itself. It's just part of the rationality.
It is if you know that people don't always make the best rational decisions.
Yeah, so that's, like, the thing that I'm trying to say there is that the thing that changes it from a good to a bad, which is to a benefit to the person, to a chaos, is not the self-interest. It's the rationality of the person.
From a good to a bad?
Yeah, because what makes it chaotic mm-hmm. is because individual person is not rational enough. But what makes it good is
the lack of rationality.
Exactly, the lack of rationality.
That's
what I'm trying to say.
Well, but so you're saying that if you put a bunch of people together that are all acting in their immediate and direct self-interest, and they all have perfect rationality, that they would all immediately act in each other's interest.
No. I mean, like, that's what Rousseau is trying to say.
But that it would become a structured society, non-chaotic.
Exactly. Whilst if they didn't have...
I'd agree with that, but I don't think people are that rational.
Yeah, obviously. And that's why there's problems with our current society, because there's some forms of irrationality that happens in our society that leads to chaos in some senses. So since we're not perfectly rational, our societies can't be perfectly formed either.
You've introduced an interesting factor. I don't think... But, okay, here's my issue with that. Is that they would only know that the most rational thing to do is to act in each other's interest if they've seen the results of acting in each other's interests and against each other's interests. Which would mean that there would have to be there would have to be a period of chaos in which people figure that out. I don't think you could rationally deduce, if you're like a fresh new human being in the world, that acting in others' interest benefits you.
So you're trying to say that self-interest removed from rationality in all makes it so that it's chaos.
Yeah, at least initially.
Okay, because they don't have any rationality at all.
Right. Well, they do, but they haven't seen the precedents.
And that's how societies form. I mean,
that's why I agree with Hobbes, is that a society fixes that.
Yeah.
It's like a trial and error type thing.
It fixes the chaos, sure, but I mean,
and it fixes the self-interest.
The thing is that self-interest
fixes is a kind of problematic word, but what we're trying to say.
And I'm trying to say that self-interest is still there. It's not like self-interest goes away when you're in a society or when you're in morality.
No, but the society fixes that.
What do you mean by fix then?
Society transfers into something that can possibly be used for good.
Good.
Also, another issue. I don't think it always in every situation. Sometimes rationality plus self-interest equals kill everybody. It doesn't equal working with others in every situation. So I don't think it's
well, I mean, it's if you're talking about the interest of the person is to see as many people die, right? Then sure. But I mean, that's not necessarily part of our human psychology necessarily.
Yeah, well, I think the issue I'm having is I think we're overvaluing human cooperation. Because as we've seen, it doesn't always work. As we've seen in history, there's tons and tons of examples of people who have tried. Because of people who have tried that route, and for some reason or other failed, because it's easier to go against that, because I think it's kind of the long route. It's a more safe but longer route if you're going to try and cooperate with everyone in order to achieve your self-interest. Not in every situation, but in some it can be. I don't think that made sense. Didn't make any sense.
So what I'm trying to understand, what I sort of understand from that is that you're saying that working with other people is the safer, but it's the one that is
not safer, more stable, I guess.
It's the stabler option, and also, but it will take longer. But if you choose not to cooperate, then that is faster.
It can be in some situations.
Well,
if you have the here's another. Let's introduce another factor. Is that not everyone? Some people have natural advantages over other people. physical, powered, political, social. Like, even as, like, fresh new beings in the world. And so sometimes it would be easier for them, if they were acting entirely in their self-interest, to, harm others.
Okay. I mean, like...
Or act against other self-interest.
Yeah, I think the main part where I feel like we are not able to discuss properly here is when we are trying to define good and evil.
Wait, we're not going to be able to define good and evil.
I mean, like, there's a difference between trying to... Because, I mean, like, when you say that self-interest is naturally bad or is inherently bad or inherently good, or you're saying that cooperation is inherently good or evil. I mean, like, I don't define... Like, when I'm thinking of it in my mind, I don't necessarily...
Okay, let's try and define that. I'm going to say my definition. You're probably going to hate it. It's good if it prevents a state of chaos, which is the state of nature. And it's bad if it creates a state of chaos.
Okay, but why? Like, why is chaos...
Because in a state of chaos... Well, first of all, it's just more dangerous. Like, you're more likely to die. And it's just, like, less humanitarian. Because there are no more, like, good things, Like, in a state of chaos, morality isn't valued, Like, so just, like, terrible things can happen to everyone at all times.
So you're saying chaos...
I'd say not good.
Okay. So... The thing is that I feel like there's an underlying assumption there, which is something that we both agree with, where it's trying to say that in a state of chaos, it's hard for you to achieve your interests.
Some people might be achieving their interests.
Yeah, some people. But I mean, like, the thing is that when you're talking about chaos, it's less predictable to make things happen. So what I'm trying to explain in that sense is...
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's harder. That's why you gotta cooperate. I think most people agree with that. I don't think there would be anyone that would straight up be like, in a state of chaos, you achieve your interest really fast.
And that's what I'm trying to say. And that is what your definitions of good and evil are. But those aren't necessarily good or evil. What is trying to do is that one is more beneficial to whatever your interests are, and one is more detrimental to your interests. Because in chaos...
Which, some people would...
But the thing is that in chaos, though...
It's not necessarily your own interest. It's like the collective interest of human beings.
Ooh, this is an interesting thing. Why should we care about other human beings' interests?
Well, that's what we've been talking about.
I mean, like the thing is that with Rousseau and Hobbes, they both think differently on this aspect. Because Rousseau, when he's talking about his theory of contractualism, which is similar to contractarianism, but he says that the reason why we have morality there is because there's rational beings that have a moral status. Whilst with Hobbes, he's saying that there is a self-interest which makes us cooperate with other people later on.
Yes.
Okay. So the thing is that in both of those things, Hobbes is thinking in the sense that you don't necessarily need to care about other people inherently, whilst Rousseau is inherently putting his more theory of morality in the sense that you have to care about other people.
Why? No, he's not. Wait, why?
Because if you have moral status to any rational agent.
Wait, what do you mean by moral status to? What does that mean? Meaning
that they are morally valuable.
More morally valuable, or just
the equal moral value. That's what I'm trying to say. You have equal moral value to any other person. Whilst in Hobbes, there isn't a necessary part of that.
Wait, I still don't see why Rousseau is arguing that there's moral status.
And that's the thing. Okay.
I
And that's the
don't
thing.
understand.
So it's like
What do you mean?
Rousseau is trying to say that we have morality based upon the moral status of a rational conscious being. And the reason why we do that is because we are trying to we are trying to define what constitutes what is right and what is wrong in that sense, based upon what is.
Okay.
Sorry. I mean, like, that was
Yeah. Okay. I think we've gone on for a really long time.
Yeah, sort
I
of.
don't know when we started, so
I don't know
this
either.
could have been like 50 minutes.
Could have been.
But I think you agree with me.
In some aspects,
At
yes,
the end
but
of
I
the
don't.
day,
But the
I
main
think I've
thing,
convinced you.
I mean, like, I wouldn't say I would say that I already agreed with most parts of with Hobbes' thinking. It's just the main thing that I disagree with how they both think is that they both have a definition. They both are trying to define good and evil as something that is innate to the world, which is something that I fundamentally disagree
Wait, but
with.
how are you going to get anywhere if you go by an individual basis for what's good and bad? That's not.
That's the same way that Hobbes defines his moral value. I mean, like, that's the same way that in contractarianism, you have morality based upon agreement, right? And in that situation, it's not that you need a moral good or evil to have morals. Like, this is an interesting question that I wanted to bring up, but I don't think we have enough time. But what I wanted to bring up was, how is morality related to the concept of good and evil? Is it related? Does it have to be? And
I
it's
see. We can make another episode on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I don't think there'd be anyone that would. Well, there are. I just don't think there are that many people that directly agree with Rousseau. So.
I mean, like, they might be. Like, I feel like some people.
Actually, that might be a lie. I think a lot of people actually agree with it. Okay.
Like, a lot of people agree with him because they see that as an inherent value to their person, that you inherently value other people at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like the main difference between Hobbes and Rousseau is that Rousseau has an inherent value in other people, right? Whilst Hobbes does not. And that's sort of like
but that
like-
goes into whether or not do you have.
like, I personally agree more with Hobbes than Rousseau, right?
Yeah.
But-
Same.
Same.
Relatable. Okay.
What's it called again? But the point is that that's where I see the two differences between Rousseau and Hobbes, where Hobbes is trying to formulate a place of a society where there's compassion and there's more stuff like that in society and whatever, right? And like, we form those compassionate and other good stuff. I'm using good with air quotes again. In society, right? Whilst Rousseau is trying to say that is an innate part of something that we have to have in a moral society. But that's sort of weird way to put it. But again,
I think that's a good conclusion to come to.
Super good.
I still don't agree with you. All right.
all right.
That's it for this episode.
Yeah. And again, guys, always sources in the description or below or somewhere, like in the void of
There's
space.
somewhere. You'll figure it out.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay. Bye-bye. This
Okay.
is really long. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, guys.